Hello, I'm Dr. Jonina Anderson Lopez. You're watching the second video lecture for the course, and we're going to discuss structure and perspective. So, story structure, what is it? It's basically all the parts of a story, and this can include varied styles like POV, narration, or other storytelling devices. We'll review these concepts along with perspectives and the assignments for this week. A review of story structure and perspective can aid in your analysis of subsequent stories for this course. So let's start with point of view. And these are terms you've probably already discussed in other literature or writing classes, but just to refresh your memory. First person perspective, like in Fight Club, it lets characters recount events. Second person, like in the fantasy epic, The Fifth Season, is when you're engaging a reader directly, sometimes using the term you in the narration to make it seem more personable. For a third person, like with Pan's Labyrinth, it's that omniscient narrator that's providing the all-knowing kind of mood. Narrative, or how a story is told, includes the stuff that you see on the screen, all of which further enhance storytelling. Structure in literature, and that term by itself, structure, not the parts of a story like we're talking about in this lecture. Structure in literature refers to the organization and arrangement of a story, and this can mean things like plot, chapters, sections, and chronology. There's stories with chapters told from multiple character perspectives, like Broken Monsters, or maybe a story where each chapter or every few chapters reads like a new short story and they're ultimately linked into a larger story. And we see those examples on screen, the Joy Luck Club or the Bone Clocks. There's even epistolary stories like House of Leaves, and this is when the narrative is partially or fully conveyed in the form of a series of letters. Memory plays into this because stories are not always told in order. Additionally, characters don't always remember things fully or correctly. Memory in literature and storytelling is the use of past events and experiences to create a narrative or add depth to characters and settings. Memories can be presented through a character's recollections, flashbacks, or even as a form of narration. They can serve as a way to explore the past, reveal a character's motivations or psychological state, and provide context for the present story. Memories can also create a sense of nostalgia or melancholy as characters reflect on lost or happier times. The use of memory in literature and storytelling can add complexity, making things more relatable and engaging for readers. Therefore, when analyzing a story, consider how memory is subjective and a separate reality explored in so many stories from this module or other modules. Tone in literature refers to the attitude or mood conveyed by the author through language, style, and word choice. This shapes the overall atmosphere of the work. Storytelling devices in literature include foreshadowing, flashbacks, imagery, mystery box, among others. These can also enhance the narrative by adding depth, complexity, and emotional impact to a story. Many of the stories we're focusing on during the course of the semester feature strong first-person narratives or just literary devices you might not have encountered before. And what does this have to do with cultural studies or world literature? From my view, thwarting traditional narrative structures is always a great recipe for a new story. Additionally, the way a story is told is important, And seeing a familiar storytelling mode, such as first person from a different culture rather than our own, can help us understand when a story might be conveying what you can call a global theme, or when it's upending our expectations and changing how we think of traditional literature. What does perspective in storytelling mean for this class? It's another part of literature overall that we're discussing this module. In terms of perspective, we'll discuss the different facets of it by reviewing what's outlined on the screen. Start with unreliable narrators. And though this is technically just another type of storytelling device, we'll discuss the unreliable narrator in terms of perspective. Sometimes a character's memory impacts their viewpoint, like we've kind of talked about. Other times, different motivations or actions might drive their unreliable accounts of the story. For this reason, I would categorize the unreliable narrator when discussing perspective in literature. That doesn't mean I'm right, but that's what we're going to do for this lecture. Multiple viewpoints. So in certain stories, the same story can be told in different ways, multiple perspectives. For example, in a bamboo grove, sometimes referred to as in a grove, the preceding events unfurl in a series of testimonies, first by passers-by, an auxiliary policeman, and a relative, then by the three main protagonists, the samurai, his wife, and a bandit. But the truth remains hidden due to the contradictory accounts that are given. This story also inspired a film from 1950 that we'll review in week 4. It's called Rashomon. If a story like this features different characters narrating the same story, it might allow for multi-layers of meaning and multi-layers of what is reality and who determines reality. One viewpoint. So in other stories, as we're going to review, one narrator shares their worldview. And this can happen in different ways. So for instance, in My Struggle, imagine if you journaled about a time in your life, moment by moment, detail by detail. Could you do that? Because this is exactly what Karl of Nosgard did while writing My Struggle. And there's several different books in this series. So the one perspective the audience gets from his stories is that of his stream of consciousness, kind of, and it's just chronicling his life. And because he's including detail at such a granular level, some of his books only chronicle one day. And I can remember one passage describing how he's making coffee, how he's putting in one lump of sugar, another lump, and it's just very tedious. So that when something impactful happens, it feels like an explosion to break from that tedium. In both of Kafka's stories from this module, we're immersed in Kafkaesque. So what does that term mean? It refers to unnecessarily complicated and frustrating experiences, especially with bureaucracy. The style of telling a story in this way was popularized by Kafka, and it gave birth to that term, Kafkaesque. Consider this one perspective if you choose to read these two one-page stories. Retellings and perspective. Let's talk about that next and consider how it's important to storytelling. There are several types of retellings like what you see on the screen. In particular, retellings often provide expanded characterization for both the main characters and secondary figures. This allows the audience to gain a deeper understanding of their motivations, backgrounds, and personal journeys. Retellings sometimes challenge or subvert traditional expectations associated with the original story. Popular retellings in literature include the examples that you see on the screen, like Wide Sargasso Sea, I'm probably butchering that name, which reimagines the story of Jane Eyre from the perspective of Mr. Rochester's first wife. There's also a story that we're going to see later in the modules, which can be Mexican Gothic. This can be considered an intertextual and modernization retelling of Wuthering Heights and other Gothic romances. Well, it's actually like Gothic horror. Retellings usually are taking an existing tale and reworking it for a modern audience. They can go beyond fairy tales to other types of genres, like retelling popular mystery stories, science fiction stories, historical fiction, and so much more. We're discussing retellings in context with fairy tales because one of the stories we'll review today, and it's in the module, can be considered a retelling of a classic fairy tale. In terms of characterization, subversion, and other types of retellings, we can understand this classic tale from a new perspective. In a modern twist of the well-known fairy tale Rumpelstiltskin, Michael Cunningham's Little Man retells the adventure of this 200-year-old gnome through the eyes of Rumpelstiltskin himself, who fell in love with a miller's beautiful daughter, which he helped do the impossible, spin straw into gold. During the event of this story, the audience sees the event unfold from one viewpoint. We see what the main character sees. Similarly, consider what it's like to immerse yourself in a perspective you never thought of before. Does a certain perspective make literature worldly or canon? All right, moving on from the lecture material, and I know it was a lot. So let's shift to talk about this week's assignments. And like last week, you have 3 assignments, but rather than 3 forums, you have 2 forums and a quiz. So for the first forum, pick one story that we just reviewed, one of the 4 that are featured in the module. Once you have read it, answer corresponding questions about the story. Then do the same thing for forum 2. Both forums ask questions about 2 particular stories, but if you didn't choose any of those stories, respond to the first forum with one of the 4 stories from the week, and then respond to the second forum with your other chosen story, answering those questions about it. Remember that both forums require responses to your peers after your initial post. For each forum response, add at least 1 in-text citation, a correct citation to back up a point that you're making. Remain consistent. Are you using MLA or APA? This formatting choice should be apparent in your in-text citation that's embedded in your paragraphs of analysis. As you can see from the examples, there are slight differences between MLA and APA formatting methods. Your third assignment is a quiz. It's the first of 2 quizzes for the course. Review the academic readings and lectures from these first 2 weeks to prepare for the quiz. Overall, quizzes account for 10% of your course grade, so make sure to submit it on time to completion. I hope you found this lecture helpful for selecting stories this week. Additionally, the storytelling terms we reviewed can be applied to analysis for subsequent GLIT 160 forums and essays. Reach out with any questions via email or WhatsApp text. Thanks for watching.